What if Toji Fushiguro was in the Shinjuku Showdown? Now for this what if, we're gonna split this into 3 parts, and honestly, the second Toji appears in the Shinjuku Showdown arc, the entire story changes immediately. So the story starts right before the fight between Satoru Gojo and Ryomen Sukuna begins. Everybody is preparing for the biggest battle of their lives, and pretty much the entire Jujutsu world is watching, because if Gojo loses here, humanity is basically finished. But right before the fight starts, something completely random happens. A strange distortion suddenly opens near the battlefield and out walks Toji Fushiguro. At first, nobody even believes what they're seeing because Toji is supposed to be dead. Even Gojo is confused for a second because the last time he saw Toji was years ago during the hidden inventory arc. But the moment Toji steps out, everybody immediately understands this is actually him. Because even without cursed energy, Toji's presence is terrifying. The guy who nearly killed Gojo, destroyed special grade curses with pure physical strength, and was known as the Sorcerer Killer, is suddenly standing in the middle of the strongest battle in history. Now at first, Toji honestly doesn't care about what's happening. He barely even understands the situation. But once everybody explains that Sukuna took over Megumi Fushiguro's body, everything changes instantly. Because no matter how cold Toji acts, hearing that his son's body is being controlled by the King of Curses immediately gets his attention. He doesn't suddenly become a good father or anything like that, but for the first time in a long time, Toji actually has a reason to fight. Meanwhile, Sukuna is interested the second he sees Toji, because he immediately notices there's something wrong about him. Toji has 0 cursed energy, which makes him almost impossible to properly sense. For somebody like Sukuna, who constantly reads cursed energy during fights, that makes Toji extremely dangerous. And honestly, this changes the entire strategy for the heroes immediately. Originally, everybody was relying on Gojo to defeat Sukuna alone, but now they suddenly have somebody who can potentially bypass a lot of Sukuna's awareness. Characters like Yuji Itadori and Yuta Okatsu quickly realize Toji might actually be one of the best support fighters possible against Sukuna. Because unlike most sorcerers, Toji doesn't fight with flashy cursed techniques. He fights like an assassin. Every movement is meant to kill as fast as possible. And with weapons like the split soul katana, and especially the inverted spear of heaven, even Sukuna has to take him seriously. Now before the battle officially begins, Gojo and Toji actually have a short conversation, and honestly it's pretty awkward. Gojo jokes around at first, saying he never expected to see Toji again, but deep down he remembers exactly how dangerous this man is, because Toji was the first person who ever truly pushed Gojo to death. Toji honestly doesn't care that much about the conversation though. He basically tells Gojo that if he dies again, he's not coming back a second time. But even then, Gojo can already tell the battle is going to go differently now. So once the fight finally starts, Gojo and Sukuna begin clashing just like in the original story. The entire battlefield starts getting destroyed instantly from the pressure alone. Buildings are collapsing, cursed energy is exploding everywhere, and every single sorcerer watching can barely even keep up with what's happening. But this time, there's one major difference. Toji is watching everything from the shadows. Instead of jumping in immediately, Toji waits for openings. He studies Sukuna's movements carefully, looking for blind spots and weaknesses, and honestly, this is something Sukuna isn't used to. Sukuna is used to overwhelming opponents head on, but Toji fights completely differently from everybody else there. At one point during the fight, while Sukuna is focused completely on Gojo, Toji suddenly appears behind him at insane speed and swings the split soul katana directly towards Sukuna's neck. Sukuna barely reacts in time, blocking the attack at the last possible second, but for the first time during the fight, Sukuna is genuinely caught off guard, and the second that happens, Gojo realizes something important. Toji might actually be capable of creating openings even Gojo himself couldn't normally create alone. And honestly, that's where this battle truly starts changing. Now after that first surprise attack, the battle immediately starts getting way harder for Ryomen Sukuna, because now he has to deal with 2 completely different fighters at once. On one side, he has Satoru Gojo constantly overwhelming him with limitless and insane cursed energy attacks. But on the other side, he has Toji Fushiguro moving around the battlefield like an invisible assassin that Sukuna can barely properly track, and honestly, this starts frustrating Sukuna almost immediately, because every single time he fully focuses on Gojo, Toji appears out of nowhere trying to land another deadly hit. But when Sukuna turns his attention toward Toji, Gojo immediately punishes him from the front. The pressure from fighting both of them at once honestly starts becoming insane. Now meanwhile, everybody watching the fight is completely shocked. Characters like Yuji Itadori, Maki Zenin, and Yuta Okatsu can barely even believe what they're seeing, because Toji is actually keeping up with the strongest fighters in the world using nothing but raw physical ability and cursed tools. Even Maki realizes just how terrifying Toji truly was in his prime. Now eventually, the fight still reaches the domain expansion clash, and honestly, this is where things start changing even more from the original story. story. Because while Gojo and Sukuna are locked into their domain battles, Toji becomes incredibly important. Since he has no cursed energy, the domains don't affect him the same way they affect normal sorcerers. This allows Toji to move around the battlefield more freely while the domains are active. At one point, while Satoru Gojo and Sukuna are both heavily damaged after another domain clash, Toji suddenly rushes straight towards Sukuna with the inverted Spear of Heaven. And honestly, this becomes one of the most dangerous moments in the fight so far. Because if Toji lands a clean hit with that weapon, there's a chance he could temporarily disrupt Sukuna's curse technique entirely. Sukuna barely manages to avoid the direct stab, but Toji still slices across Sukuna's shoulder, actually damaging him badly enough to surprise everybody watching. And for the first time in the battle, Sukuna stops smiling for a second, because now he realizes Toji is not just a distraction, he's an actual threat. Now because of this, Sukuna starts changing his fighting style completely. Instead of only focusing on overpowering Gojo, Sukuna begins actively trying to eliminate Toji first. But honestly, that's easier said than done. Toji's speed combined with his lack of cursed energy makes him ridiculously hard to pin down. Every time Sukuna thinks he has him cornered, Toji escapes at the last possible second. Meanwhile, Gojo honestly starts fighting even harder now that he has support. In the original story, Gojo was carrying the entire fight alone, but now he actually has somebody creating openings for him. This allows Gojo to land several attacks that normally would have been much harder to pull off. At one point, Gojo lands a massive black flash directly on Sukuna after Toji distracts him for half a second, sending Sukuna crashing through multiple buildings. And honestly, this is where the battle starts slowly shifting toward the heroes, because Sukuna is finally being forced into uncomfortable situations. Even with Mahoraga adapting in the background, Sukuna is taking far more damage than he originally did. The constant pressure from both Gojo and Toji is making it way harder for him to fully control the pace of the battle. But eventually, Sukuna realizes something important. As dangerous as Gojo is, Toji is becoming the bigger problem long term, because unlike curse techniques, Toji's raw physical abilities can't really be adapted to the same way. So Sukuna decides he needs to separate them somehow before the fight gets even worse. And honestly, that decision is where everything starts getting dangerous for everybody involved. Now at this point, Ryomen Sukuna fully understands he cannot keep fighting both Satoru Gojo and Toji Fushiguro at the same time forever. The constant pressure is starting to overwhelm even him. So instead of continuing the fight normally, Sukuna finally decides to play smarter. And honestly, this is where things start getting really dangerous, because Sukuna begins using Megumi Fushiguro's techniques way more aggressively. Multiple Shikigami start appearing across the battlefield at once, forcing Gojo and Toji to split their attention. Massive destruction starts covering the entire city, and for the first time during the fight, the heroes begin losing control of the battlefield. Now meanwhile, Toji realizes something important almost immediately. Sukuna is trying to separate him from Gojo, because together they're too difficult to deal with. So instead of chasing Sukuna recklessly, Toji starts focusing on eliminating the Shikigami and keeping pressure on Sukuna whenever openings appear. At one point, Sukuna manages to force Gojo into another massive clash, while Toji gets temporarily trapped dealing with Mahoraga. And honestly, this becomes one of the craziest moments in the fight, because unlike most opponents, Toji can actually keep up with Mahoraga physically. The two start tearing through entire buildings while fighting hand to hand, and everybody watching is completely shocked seeing somebody without cursed energy fighting one of the strongest Shikigami in history. But even then, Toji slowly starts realizing how dangerous Mahoraga really is, because the longer the fight continues, the more Mahoraga adapts to his speed and fighting style. Eventually, Toji gets caught off guard for a split second and gets slammed straight through multiple buildings. Meanwhile, back on Gojo's side of the battlefield, Sukuna finally starts gaining momentum again. Without Toji constantly interrupting him, Sukuna can focus completely on adapting to infinity. And honestly, this is where the battle starts becoming closer to the original story again. But before Sukuna can fully take advantage of the situation, Toji suddenly returns to the battlefield completely injured but still ready to fight. And honestly, this surprises even Sukuna, because most people would already be dead after taking hits from Mahoraga. But Toji's raw durability and insane physical strength allow him to keep going. Now this is where the final push begins. Gojo and Toji immediately coordinate without even speaking. Gojo attacks Sukuna head-on, while Toji circles around from the blind spots again. The pressure becomes overwhelming, and Sukuna is forced to constantly defend from multiple angles. At one point, Toji finally lands a clean stab with the inverted Spear of Heaven directly into Sukuna's side, temporarily disrupting his curse technique for a moment. And honestly, that single opening changes everything, because the second Sukuna's technique is interrupted, Gojo immediately fires a maximum output Hollow Purple directly at him, him, the attack completely destroys the surrounding area, and for a second, everybody watching honestly thinks Sukuna might actually be finished. But once the smoke clears, Sukuna is still standing, barely. His body is heavily damaged, Mahoraga is partially destroyed, and for the first time in the entire fight, Sukuna genuinely looks angry instead of calm, because now he realizes he was actually pushed to the edge. Now honestly, this is where I think the story would completely split from canon, because even though Sukuna survives, he's way weaker than he originally was after fighting Gojo, which means characters like Yuji Itadori, Yuta Okatsu, Maki Zenin, and everybody else now have a way better chance once they enter the battle. And honestly, there's even a possibility Gojo survives this version of the fight, because Toji's interference prevented Sukuna from controlling the battle the same way he did originally, meaning the heroes could actually overwhelm Sukuna before he fully adapts again. But honestly, the craziest part of this entire what if is probably Megumi, because deep inside, Megumi would know his father was one of the main reasons Sukuna was finally pushed this far, and that would completely change Megumi's story forever. Hope you guys liked this video. Make sure to like and subscribe, and make sure to go check out my video, What If Module Yuji Was in the Shinjuku Showdown?